All right, guys, let's talk about the Civil War in brief here. So we're looking at the era, essentially what I consider to be the Civil War times 1850 with the 1850 Compromise through 1865 at the end of armed aggression and Appomattox Courthouse. So in 1860, Lincoln is going to be elected, with the southern states actually not having put Lincoln even on their ballot to be a possible presidential candidate. This kind of signals the end of the balance of power and representation and controlling the elections, because in this case, the South, a much larger rural and agrarian or farming society area, they simply don't have the population numbers to even mount an electoral battle for someone that the northern, more populated areas, more industrious areas want to put forth. The first actual firing of the Civil War itself is going to go on in 1861 in South Carolina, in Charleston, at Fort Sumter. In this case, the Fort Sumter down here in South Carolina is technically a federal, meaning like the Union side fort. But now, because South Carolina has seceded from the Union, it creates an interesting situation to where, technically, should this be a Confederate fort, or should this indeed still remain with the Union? Nobody really has an answer for that. Eventually, shots are fired and a battle ensues. Four more southern states are going to secede later in 1861 when Lincoln finally calls up for not a draft per se just yet, but volunteers. And he gets about 100,000 troops to volunteer to create the Army of the Potomac. And their goal is to preserve the Union. So remember, Lincoln has a lot going on in his head. He's very much aware of the delicate balance, especially with those border states that may or may not end up actually staying, per se, with the Union if he makes decisions about slavery from the get-go. Now, you cannot deny that slavery was most certainly caused the Civil War. It may even be the greatest cause of the Civil War underneath the surface, and on the surface for that matter. But Lincoln did not want to make the actual conflict itself, the war, about slavery just yet. He did not want to infuriate and lose those border states that were still practicing slavery. So Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, these are the big three. They, of course, are still practicing slavery. They are very more akin and close-knit to the Confederate States of America, and it will be an ongoing struggle trying to keep them in the Union, but still choosing these more liberal approaches to reforming slavery as an institution. Now, the Union strategy is given to them by General Winfield Scott before he leaves the actual army itself. Scott has a pretty grandiose idea here that he calls the Anaconda Plan. Obviously, it's about choking off and strangling and then squeezing to death the South. And this is actually a pretty solid plan. The Anaconda Plan, as he calls it, is meant to go on and overcome some of the advantages the South may have or may develop and kind of block them from really having anything to do with it. It's going to exploit dependence on this foreign trade, and it's going to, Yeah, I'm just recording it for the other class. I'm sorry. I'm just going quickly. Anywho, as I was saying, so the Southern dependence on foreign trade and industrialization really gives the South a pretty heavily weakened stance on things and makes them very susceptible towards some more industrial power controlling the path of the war. Whereas the North, it has this massive population, massive industry. It does have the capability to build a larger army, but at the start, unfortunately, a lot of the actual leaders of the army side with the Confederacy. So in this large plan to choke off the South, Ulysses S. Grant is going to take charge of most of the western atmosphere with the actual campaigns, and George McClellan is initially put in charge of the Union armies in the East. Not a good decision. Now, understand that Lincoln had a lot of advisors, especially in the War Department, telling him, well, obviously, the best of generals are now part of the Confederacy, so we want to settle for our second-rate guys. And McClellan was very well thought of. He was respectable. He had a service record, so on and so forth. He, then Meade, and other generals be chosen to lead the Army of the Potomac initially. And Lincoln was listening to a lot of his advisors until he came to a realization himself that maybe Grant's approach that kind of got him a bad name amongst other officers was the way to win the war. So, there's a great what-if scenario. Yes, Grant was very young, but had Grant been given a more supremacy position earlier on, maybe even commander of the Army of the Potomac, would even Gettysburg have happened? Could the war have stopped with Antietam or something even earlier than that? There's a great what-if scenario to be said there. Now, the Northern Army is going to try to set themselves up to where they realize that their capital in D.C. is very close, so there will always be a standing army there. The South is putting itself into a position to fight this war of attrition. Attrition meaning a war that just goes on, and there's some way to always stay in defense and just kind of make things stretch out. Now, all the while our Civil War is going on, the western part of Europe is very heavily into a second industrial revolution. They're expanding things. There's a massive population boom, and they're looking for cotton for textiles and clothes and other odds and ends. And Britain is consuming a lot of cotton. And you can probably imagine their number one supplier of cotton was the southern part of the United States, now called the Confederate States of America. This king cotton industry really dictated a lot of foreign policies and decisions with should France and England actually join the Confederacy or at least supply support to the Confederacy? Does the South even have a chance of winning? These are a lot of questions that would have to be addressed. Ultimately, however, I guess luckily as it were also, the European powers observed the Civil War as kind of like this first modern war of tactics and new weaponry, especially the rifling bullet, but did not actually openly support the South, especially after 1862. Now, Robert E. Lee is a very distinguished commander, having been a scout during the Mexican-American War, worked his way up, and now he's very highly respected, one of the leading colonels of the actual Union Army before he leaves with his state of Virginia and takes over the Army of Northern Virginia. Political leadership, of course, is going to be Lincoln in the north, Jefferson Davis in the south. Lincoln has a minimal amount of military experience, having been in the reserve group from Illinois, but ultimately he is very dependent on advice from his generals and his War Department. He is going to decide to suspend the practice of habeas corpus, this law that actually says if you're going to arrest somebody, you need to kind of tell them and show them the evidence on you did this, and this is what we think, we're going to hold you. Now you don't need to do that. You talk against the government, you could be arrested. That practice was gone during most of the Civil War. He's also going to exert some very heavy and very questionable First Amendment challenges. In this case, do we close down newspapers, especially ones who openly write about, well, I don't really like that the North is doing this. And this becomes a much bigger deal later on because, sure enough, freedom of speech leads to some folks who were wanting to acquiesce to the South and just openly surrender. So maybe he should have taken even more action there. Who knows? In the South, we have Jefferson Davis, whose CSA Constitution, the Confederate States of America Constitution, is very heavily akin to the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution for the United States. Very much so pro-states' rights that essentially they're giving minimal amount of power necessary to the central authority of the government, which, it's had they looked just a little bit closer at why the Articles was replaced, they might have noticed that one of the key things was economy and capability of the central government to execute things necessary for the continuation of the idea of the system. In this case, the actual new government, the new country. The currency for the South is going to go through this hyperinflation, at one point reaching 7,000+% inflation, which basically means it's not worth anything. So they never really got off the ground and make an economy. These two national governments are going to, for the most part, rely on volunteer enlistments. They would, of course, start a draft pretty early on in 61, 62. But there would still be a large majority for both of them who were still volunteer soldiers. Here are the numbers for the Southern Confederate Army. Just under 1 million, so we're calling about 800,000 people, we believe. 120,000 of those would be drafted. So call that 10, 15, at most 15%. There were also some substitutes. So as it happened, some people could actually sub in, say send one of their slaves to go serve as a kitchen master or something like that, or a courier, just other odds and ends, but nothing of importance, and most certainly nothing that would give one of the slaves who was going to go serve the army some kind of weapon or military training. There are also other substitutes going on where you could have, like, say, your son go in your stead if you were drafted, or some fathers even go in the place of their son because they were older, had some experience, and felt the compelling to go do so. Desertions become huge, 100,000. So we're talking about 1 out of 8 people in the Confederate Army over the course of about 4 years, they would actually try to flee and just leave the war. Total deaths, more than a quarter of them. And of those, we're talking a large majority were disease and side effects of battle wounds that, like now we know could be taken care of pretty readily in a medical hospital. But at the time, no. And, this is one of those great moments in history where doctors, nurses, and basically the health field in general took these massive leaps and bounds because they had so many cadavers and living but almost dead people to operate on and try things on. And of course, they like to take out their saw blade and actually cut off entire ligaments and just, okay, well, you've now had your leg amputated. And it was necessary because the way the bullets were used then in the rifles, because they could actually just hit and explode and cause this massive amount of damage, whereas like a musket ball would simply like pierce into your skin, and yes, it could be fatal, but not always. Pretty much when you get shot by an actual rifled round, as in the case of the Civil War, it would shatter your bone into pieces. It would go all sorts of places, called blood infections, screw up your bone density. It wasn't good, and not many people were able to survive these. On the flip side, the Union forces, kind of like show you here, 800,000 versus 2.1 million at its height. So, we're almost talking a 300% difference. Total draftees and substitutes, not very many, comparatively percentage-wise, about 164,000. Substitutes, about 100,000. Total desertions, 200,000. So once again, in this case, like 1 out of 10 people desert, and they just get tired of fighting. Deaths from battles and disease is also, if you look at it, a little bit higher here for the North. 360,000 Northern troops, we believe, die. And of course, that number, it's up for different statistics. And yes, of course, there's always more battleground mass graves found, so on and so forth. So these are just rough numbers. Somewhere around 600,000 people did die during the war, though. Now, in the North, the place of freedom and great things and all this, and supposedly the higher moral ground in the conflict also, they would still have some issues to deal with domestically in their own back door, so to speak. In this case, the New York City draft riots are pretty infamous for kind of showing just how many people, especially around the war, did not want to keep fighting their brothers. It wasn't that popular idea, and there was a lot of influential people who would actually start pushing for this idea of peace at any cost. And as you could imagine, that once again, that could be a very terrible what-if scenario for slavery as an institution and the United States as an idea as well. Fighting for the first 2 or so years was pretty one-sided. The majority of battle victories quite handily went to the Confederates, who had, of course, the better leaders, had better organization, and if you look at it, they're legitimately fighting for their own way of life. We most certainly probably disagree with their way of life and what they were doing with their institution of slavery. Nonetheless, they were fighting for it, and you tend to fight harder when you are fighting for something you believe in, and this is like your last chance to hold on to it. There were still plenty of disagreements, and especially in the North, we saw a lot of disagreements between the leadership because, like I say, these were by and large second-rate colonels in the Army had been promoted to general when we actually declared war. How do you put it nicely? They didn't get along. They didn't agree with tactics, and there was a lot of miniature power struggles. And then you have to also consider the White House transformed and built what we call today the Situation Room during the Civil War. And at this time in the 1860s, Lincoln had telegraphs coming in with like live reports of battle actions. And I mean, there are tens of thousands of battle actions during the Civil War throughout the country. It's a lot of stuff going on. Some of the key battles, the first battle of Bull Run, we'll have 2 Bull Run battles. This first one's really fascinating to me because both sides, the North and South, believed that their volunteer forces being called up would win the day and go on and leave victorious and march on to victory. And hopefully by the end of 1861, them Yankees or them Rebs would be put down and put in their place, and the countries would continue on the course that they had for the last few decades before. That was a belief. So much so that some of the aristocrats, the very wealthy of both sides, would actually go out and have tea parties and prepare to watch the battle take place and beat the other side to a bloody pulp. It was a bloody pulp, and a lot of the aristocrats were kind of grossed out by it and fled. And it really made the country aware that this was not a simple conflict that would be done in a few matter of months. It would be quite a long campaign. Key battles over in the west: Shiloh and New Orleans. Seven Pines, CSA wins those. The 7 Days Battle, the Second Bull Run, Confederates win again. So basically in the first a year and a half of the war, you look at it as an east versus a west campaign, even though it is, of course, north versus south geographically. The eastern campaign is terrible for the Union armies. The leadership in the east were very much hesitant to push through and do follow-up assaults, double down on defensive maneuvers. They were more of the mind to minimize casualties and accept even tacit victories as being like, hey, we live to fight another day, so let's retreat out of here before we lose this land. It wasn't going very well in the east. Whereas in the west, with Grant as one of the commanders, the Anaconda Plan that was supposed to choke off the South by having this naval blockade along the coast and major ports and along some of the routes there for their smugglers. In the Mississippi River, they want to keep Louisiana and Texas out of the main conflict because, I mean, let's face it, it's Texas. Texas has won its independence here like 2 decades earlier, and they know how to fight, and there's a lot of people there. So let's not allow them too readily to be in the battles. Texas regiments did, however, serve in many battles in the eastern campaigns, and by and large, they were, by most accounts, some of the hardest fighting souls in the Confederate Army as well. They had a lot to fight for them also. But the Anaconda Plan along the Mississippi River wanted to cut that off and keep it to where trade could not go on. Commerce could not continue without the Mississippi River. In this case, the Union Navy and the Union Army would control it. At the end of 1862, we see the bloodiest 24-hour cycle in American military history with the Battle of Antietam. General Lee's first attempt to invade outside the Confederate States was luckily halted by General McClellan and the Union armies. And the battle goes down without any kind of stated winner. You know, both sides lost so many men. We're talking some estimates all the way up to possibly 20,000 people die in just a matter of hours on one of the days of Antietam. So it's not pretty. It's very gory, and it just shows you how much resolve was on both sides to win the war. The battle goes down as a turning point in the Civil War military history because the European observers from Britain and France are looking at the Confederate Army, and they're saying, you know, maybe y'all could say you won this battle, but just by sheer numbers and sheer brute force, the North is finally starting to mobilize, and we don't see the South winning. So they meaning the European countries, will start to look for another source of cotton. In this case, they find it in the Giza Plateau in Egypt. The battle also is a pretty key moment for Abraham Lincoln, who is now convinced that the time had finally come to discuss the slavery question and how it relates to the war itself. Once again, he does not want to irritate the border states into leaving or anything like that. So what he's going to do in his issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation is free the slaves in the South, and this gives him the kind of famous title of the Great Emancipator and the such. But it allows the states, the border states, to still practice slavery. In this case, Missouri, Kentucky especially, they can maintain their slavery numbers. It will not apply to them. And like I said earlier, this gives a path to citizenship for the freed slaves and for the runaway slaves that are now living in the North. So the executive order, as part of the Emancipation Proclamation, is going to go on, and once again, it sets up that path to citizenship. It also sets a precedence and an announcement for the military in the North, saying that, hey, slavery is now one of the war aims. So the border states kind of look at this probably quite questioningly on like, well, We see the writing on the wall now. Do we leave? And at this point in the war, it was pretty clear to even the North that they were going to win. It was just going to be a hard-fought, very long war because the South was able to utilize more guerrilla tactics and more wars of attrition motives and movements that could very well have made the Civil War last even longer than it did. Here's some of the slaves running to Union lines, trying to get some supplies or directions, like what road do we take, what railroad pass can we follow. Moving on after this, we have a few key battles also still in the West. One where Stonewall Jackson is actually killed, in this case Chancellorsville. And Stonewall Jackson got his name because during the First Battle of Bull Run, he just didn't move while artillery was firing around them and bullets were flying every which way. A lot of the young volunteer troops weren't really ready and prepared for death. And Jackson there actually just stood. And so somebody commented very famously, there goes Jackson. He's standing as firm as a stone wall. When he dies in 1863, Lee laments that he has lost his left arm, that he has lost his left arm, but I've also lost my right arm. It's a really terrible moment. The right hand is typically, like your most people, their supremacy hand. This is our dominant hand that we use everything for. Imagine if you are right-handed, if you lost that hand one day, what would you be able to do with your left? Probably for most of you, you'd be like, well, we're kind of screwed for a little bit. We're going to have to figure out that left hand writing and whatnot. After all this, despite the pretty heavy cons that the South had for themselves and their chances of victory kind of nullifying themselves month by month, battle by battle, we're actually seeing the Confederates fight, especially in the East, in a more passionate and successful manner, even well into 1863, than we saw the Union troops. And a lot of that, military historians kind of point to the leadership, not just the generals up top, but also the more experienced NCOs, the non-commissioned officers and sergeants of the field as well. They were able to actually get their troops behind what they were fighting and teach them how to survive. By mid-1863, however, the northern population and this turn towards a actual total war objective, and even the industry started to just overwhelm the South. The North simply had more industry sectors and factories who were capable of producing war materials the South just could not keep up with, especially because the South had failed to secure that really close working military alliance, or at least a military agreement for purchasing from England and France, namely. The Union Army started to have massive success under Ulysses S. Grant as part of that Anaconda Plan up the Mississippi River. And when the Civil War had actually continued on, we see a couple of more great what-if scenarios on it. So kind of wrap this stuff up here. The South had definitely better leadership, most certainly in the key figures of Lee and Jackson, sure. But the sheer volume of what could be produced in the northern factories, the population, the readiness for people to jump out and actually join the military of volunteerism, it made it a pretty nasty fight. And like the numbers showed, it's almost a 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage for the South as far as how many are in their army. Now, again, this is kind of considered one of the first modern wars in world history, not just in America. Gatling guns showing up here, the rifled grooved barrels, the bullets that would actually accelerate with them, very precise and exploding on contact. We have long-range artillery for the first time. You can kind of see just how massive these things were. And like I say, a lot of European military advisors are watching the battles of the Civil War and just noticing how some of the old tactics for, marching in lines was proven to be pretty catastrophic for casualties. Clearly they didn't get the memo, because here we are 50 years after the Civil War and World War I, and the majority of European powers still fight like that against even newer technology. Other advancements include the first ironclad ships that would face each other in battle. We have the USS Monitor, this almost submarine-looking vessel over here. It had a little pivot turret up here that can move around and shoot out. And people describe some of the battles, especially the one where the Monitor and the Virginia fought each other, of The cannonballs is bouncing off the actual iron plates that they had on here. But this leads to the question over the wooden navy. And of course, this starts this new movement for most countries. America's kind of slow on it. But by 1900, the U.S. had most certainly developed a modern navy, also steel-clad battleships and the such. The old tactics used with some of these new technologies, much like World War I, devastating for American troop lives. You can get shot once and you're pretty much condemned to death on that from some of the bullets that we were using. Here's some of the battle scenes. Like I say, there were photographers who would, of course, move bodies and whatnot. I mean, you can kind of see this one right here had been dragged over because he was over here, and he's like, hey, let's put one more body in the trench. Kind of dishonorable, but take its meaning for what it's worth. These battlefields were pretty horrendous to look at, especially in the aftermath. So compared to other wars, the Civil War is by far the highest death number of any conflict the United States has found itself involved in. We have over 600,000 confirmed deaths. In World War II, we only had around 300,000. I don't mean that to diminish the importance and significance of it, just by the numbers here, folks. World War I, about 100,000 or so. The Vietnam War, about half that. The Korean War, about half of that also. The Mexican-American War, about a third of that. And it just, you look at how many people died as a unique moment to fight for the question of slavery and whether or not they want to defend it or whether they want to abolish it. 600,000 American lives were laid down for their beliefs in the 1860s. Now, all this changes in 1863. 1863 is a pivotal year for Northern advancement and Northern victories. The Union blockade, as part of Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, has largely succeeded and has been pretty great for the North at this point. France and Britain did not enter the war. They did not offer more military assistance other than some monetary purchasing. To pay for the war, Confederates, because they never really got to develop their own economy, are just printing more greenbacks, and they're all worthless. There is a video out there you can find on YouTube, The American Story of Us. We're going to watch it now, but they really show just how important the railroads were. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of miles of railway in the North versus very little in the South. Just by the population numbers here, you can kind of take a look at it. Total population over 20 million in the North versus less than 10 in the South. And remember, a lot of those were, of course, slaves. Eligible for military service, about 4 million in the North could have been drafted. In the South, just over 1 million. So it's a pretty massive population disparity there. Industrial workers, over 1 million people working in factories, and you can kind of see the Confederates, they just have their token number over there, not very many. Capability in the military comparisons here, I mean, the North had a Navy, the South didn't. That's just what it was. Iron production, North had it, South didn't. Firearms productions, North had it, South just simply didn't. Now, 1863, the Battle of Gettysburg, kind of our second turning point in the war. Robert E. Lee tried to really push some of his divisions onto the Union lines and complete his invasion of Pennsylvania, the furthest north that a Confederate army had gotten to that point in the war. The aim was to try to surround the capital and seek a unconditional surrender of the North. Unfortunately, some key lower officers in the first day of the Gettysburg campaign were able to get the high ground for the Union Army, and within 48 hours, really even faster than that for the most part, there were other corps there from the North, and the South decided to buckle in as well, even though they did not have the high ground. This is kind of one of those human situations where Lee most certainly got very cocky, and this will kind of shoot him in the foot, so to speak. Gettysburg proves to be the turning point of this war, and Lee is finally halted. He is driven back out of Pennsylvania and back into the South, and he would never again be able to mount an army large enough to invade the North like that for the rest of the war. So, after this, Vicksburg, Mississippi, over on the western fronts, Grant again is proving to be quite capable, and at this point with the capture of Vicksburg, Lincoln finally acquiesces to some of the minority calls to, promote Grant to be in charge of the entire Union Army. And a lot of people didn't like that because Grant had less decorum for talking with people. He wasn't really an upperclassman, so to speak. He didn't get along with a lot of people. He was very honest, very brash, some would say. He was also known as kind of a butcher because his casualty numbers would be higher than other generals, but he also had more victories than any other general. Sometimes in war, people die. And Grant, yes, he would try to minimize casualties, but at the end, he would be willing to order what needed to be done to actually gain victories. So, like him, hate him, try to understand him. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Lincoln pens probably his most famous letter saying that 70 years ago, our forefathers brought forth onto this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So kind of calling on the founding documents and saying this battle is kind of showing just how far we've come and we're still pushing for things. Now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is also fitting and proper that we should do this. In a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. For the brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note or long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. So just a magnificently short speech. Wouldn't you kill to have this short of a speech from a president, or really any person in a leadership role? Very concise, inspirational, still very backward-looking also on nostalgia, but also progressive and forward-thinking, saying, because they did this, we now have an obligation to do this. So he gives direction to the country. Now it is most certainly a war over slavery. There are a lot of components of the short speech he just writes out on napkins while he's on the train ride over. It's a magnificent speech. So keep that in mind. Concision matters. Under Grant's leadership, the Union Army is now a lot more aggressive. And instead of, fighting to a standstill and then kind of retreating off, now they're fighting to a standstill and doubling down and finishing off battles. Grant appoints another general to lead a new Southern campaign. William Tecumseh Sherman is going to go down history as a famous March to the Sea commander in this case. He embraces the idea of a total war, destroying anything that you can't directly and immediately use for your own troops. Destroy it so the enemy cannot regain it or use it again. In this case, we're talking burning entire crop fields, burning, in some cases, homes, villages even. He basically scorches earth all the way through the South to the Atlantic Ocean. Sherman is going to start here at Chattanooga, Tennessee. He goes through Georgia, marches all the way to Savannah on the coastline, and burns everything in there. You can kind of see the Confederate Army is just retreating for the most part away from this front. There's not really much they can do. So the Southern campaign is a huge victory, especially the Battle of Atlanta, Georgia, one of the great hubs for the trains for the Confederate Army and the Confederate country as well. And there's one of the pictures. This what he told people to do, take apart the railroads. Take everything that we can use, and if we can't use it immediately, destroy it. Lincoln is going to have to face a re-election in the middle of the Civil War. A lot of people forget, but yeah, it's still every 4 years we have an election. In this case, it was looking as if one of the generals he had fired, McClellan, was going to win. And the Democrats who wanted McClellan to win, they actually wanted to push for an end of the war at all costs, meaning the North would surrender. and we would simply have two different countries. When Atlanta fell during Sherman's March to the Sea, Lincoln became very popular because he had enabled Sherman to be put in that position to go do that. And Grant's victories had enabled the rhetoric of the campaign to move from look at all Lincoln has commanded the army to do and how much they've lost, to now look at how much Lincoln is trusting his generals to do what's necessary to win and how many battles they're winning now. In the Electoral College vote, this is a massive landslide, 91% voting in favor of re-electing Lincoln. The popular vote, kind of similar to what we have in most elections, a 55-45 split-ish. In his second inaugural address, he actually lays out a reconstruction plan for the United States, for this union, with malice towards none and charity for all. And this became a controversial issue that leads to the Reconstruction era almost split of the Republican Party between those who really want to punish the South and those who just want to bring them back in, fix their problems, occupy the South, and ensure the new changes, especially anti-slavery, were being enforced, and move on with the country. The next year in Appomattox, 1865, Grant soundly defeats Lee, and Lee is given the option at this point of doing one of two things. He could do the unconditional surrender. Most certainly that would be the more respectable thing to do at this point. I mean, he's out of troops, they're out of money, the South is lost. But many Southern commanders had also organized a massive war of attrition that would expand the Civil War potentially for an entire generation of lives. We're talking 30, 40 years longer. They were talking on fighting in the hills and creating hidden bunkers and hidden even tree houses and stuff in forests to wage war against the Northern occupation. It would be a devastation to the South. It would ruin the South. Lincoln, as honorably as he could and as politely as he could, because a lot of people held him in respect over anyone else in the South, he sent notices to his generals and colonels in the field to not pursue that war of attrition, luckily, and end the Civil War. So to kind of sum things up, from 63 to 65, the South had run out of stuff. They had run out of people, run out of supplies, run out of money. And that leads to the Northern very strong advantages taking over and winning the war. April 14th, 1865, Lincoln was shot very famously by John Wilkes Booth. The effects of the Civil War themselves: a lot of death, a lot of debt, a lot of debt. Union war cost increased the national debt from $65 million to $2.7 billion of 1865 currency, which, by our standards today, doesn't sound like a lot. Look at that amount of number, $65 million to $2.5 billion in just 4.5 years. That's a pretty significant jump. Confederate debt, of course, would be assumed by the Union as part of the Reconstruction plans. Inflation would hit massive numbers to where some people were paying 3 times as much for the same thing they were buying just 5 years earlier. Confederate inflation up much more than that, 7,000+%. We see 600,000 people die fighting for the question of slavery, but we do see what we call the Reconstruction Amendments. Even after Lincoln's death, his will for the 13th Amendment, the abolition of slavery throughout the country, was passed. All right, guys. So, in kind of your little self-thoughts and some of your discussion posting you'll be doing with the next unit, be looking at how to actually rebuild, reconstruct the United States as a union country again, and have some fun with that. Anyways, if you have questions, go on, send them over on D2L or Schoology.